Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Intern from 2015. This is not a movie that was on my radar at all. It has all the hallmarks of being something I'm not particularly interested in. It just looks kind of the advertising for it looks kind of eh. It's a movie, you know, um, movie TM, and nothing about it called out to me. But I was in a call with some friends, and we caught a clip of it that was just rotating through on YouTube or something like that, and saw it and was like, okay, that's interesting. That's enough of an interesting clip to be like, let's see if this is a movie. um and I have mixed feelings on it. I am pleasantly surprised in some respects, but in other ways, I am deeply disappointed for what this movie does do and what it doesn't do. That's a lot of non-specific talking about it, but let me get into it a little bit. This is a buddy comedy film, which is sort of not a dead genre, but one that has been floundering for a while. Obviously, the classic buddy comedy is the buddy cop comedy, of which there were a great many of varying qualities throughout the 80s and 90s. And the buddy cop comedy is kind of dead. One comes out every couple of years, and usually they're not particularly good. Buddy comedies, in a more general sense of having the like two main characters who are sort of at opposite ends of any particular spectrum and have to learn to like grow and get along with each other and learn from each other and all that, is an interesting premise, and one that is very open to a lot of different possible options. And this is an option I have never seen before and never expected to see. The setup for the film is between the two main characters are played by Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, both actors who I think are pretty okay. Not incredible actors, but have enough nuance and enough acting talent to play more than just the typical this person plays themselves. And I am actually pretty pleased with both of their performances in this film. They don't get to show off a lot, but we'll get into that. The thing that is interesting about this is that the hook is that these two characters are dramatically different in age, and the setup is Robert De Niro is like a septuagenarian who has been retired and widowed, and he doesn't know what to do with himself, and he's just trying to, you know, have a positive life for the remainder of his time without getting bored or sad or whatever else. That's not a character we see very often in movies in general. The hook is that he ends up signing up to be an intern at an e-commerce fashion company in his neighborhood, and it goes from there. This is an interesting setup. There's a lot of things that are kind of obvious as a possible way to go with this. Obviously, with his character being formerly in sort of a white collar business, so sort of white collar, sort of blue collar, and going back into an industry that is also sort of white collar, sort of blue collar. There's a lot of obvious things that could go on here in terms of him teaching her what, you know, giving her the experiences that he's had and letting her use his expertise, and she teaches him to be, you know, a little bit more modern and so on and so forth. The movie basically doesn't do that at all. It touches on it a little bit, and the whole arc sort of points that direction, but the movie is not really about that. And I think both saves itself from some of the cliches that could happen as a result of going that very obvious route, but also misses some opportunities for nuance. That's a route in the narrative that doesn't inherently have to be like boring or trite or really predictable. It could be, but I think there's a lot of potential there that they could have done and don't at all. Instead, this kind of weirdly focuses more on not the events that are not like the direct effects of these two characters. The full arc of the story mostly covers a narrative that is related to them, but is not necessarily acted upon by them. The two main characters' agency in the actual struggle of the story is pretty limited, and that doesn't make it inherently fall flat as a result, but it doesn't help. And it definitely makes it a little bit shallower as a result. I'm not going to talk specifically about the beats of the film until the end. I am going to talk a little bit about the major arc because it's very brief and not very good, and it's the weakest part of the film. But I'll leave that for the end for anybody who's actually interested in watching this film. I do want to talk about all the things I think this movie does really well. Actually, before I talk about all the things that it does really well, I'm going to talk about one thing that it does really poorly. Most of this film is written pretty well, but there are a couple of scenes that are just bizarre in terms of their inclusion. Scenes that feel like they are out of a like gross out comedy film or like a sex comedy film, and are incredibly immature. And not that either of those things are inherently bad, but one, the scenes aren't written very well, and they're not actually funny. They're just very cringy, and they don't fit the rest of the narrative at all. They feel like they could be cut out of the film completely with zero effect on the narrative tone, on other than just improving it by not being this weird speed bump in the middle of the film. But there's like two brief scenes and one slightly longer one that just bizarrely derail things and feel like something out of the mid-2000s, like a mid-2000s like bro comedy instead, and they make no sense, and I don't know why they're there. Overall, though, I think what this movie manages to do is actually pretty good. It manages to avoid a lot of the pitfalls of comedies in the 2000s and 2010s that I've talked about previously. It manages to avoid being too predictable. It manages to avoid being too trite. It's not too over the top. In terms of like things like we've talked about with the last two films with Gringo and Game Night, it manages to not go too far in the direction. It doesn't go too far in the direction of like this is just unbelievable and silly and the scene only exists to drive the narrative. There are a lot of kind of core issues to some of the arcs that are just this conflict only exists because they need to leverage it for the narrative, but none of them are so overt that you're just screaming at the screen like, why didn't you just do this? So it's a mixed bag in terms of the narrative issues, but the scenes that come out of them are satisfying enough mostly on their own that and seem very earnest. I'm gonna repeat that just because I think that characterizes the whole movie. Is the movie seems very earnest in everything that it does. So even when it's trying too hard or gets a little bit too predictable or like takes itself a little bit too seriously. Actually, the very few points at which the movie takes itself too seriously. It really rides that line very nicely. Um, uh, the My point being that it is earnest through and through. It seems to it doesn't make a lot of the very obvious jokes that it could about, oh, this person's young and this person's old and they don't understand each other, what a wacky situation. Like, it does almost none of that, and the interactions between De Niro and Hathaway are almost universally just wonderful to watch. They play off each other really well. They have a surprising amount of like really positive chemistry, and it seems like a really like positive sort of fostering thing without delving into some tropified thing of like a grandfather. Like, it's not like it doesn't end up in a space where it feels like a grandfather lecturing his granddaughter, or like some 20 something or 30 something like lecturing the boomers on how they're a fuck up, or they've ruined the situation or whatever. Like, all of their interactions, even more than the rest of the film, are incredibly earnest and honest, and not always the deepest. That's a thing I would have liked to see a lot more of, is just like some more deeper conversations from them, because they have the chemistry to do it. But it manages to lay a pretty good balance there. The presentation is fine. It looks like the film that it is. In that, I mean, a comedy film from 2015, I expect to look exactly like this. It's the lighting, the cinematography, all of that is sort of fine. It's visually, it works. There are a few choices, actually, mostly in those same scenes where it's just derails for like 3 minutes for no reason. Those are where the cinematography and the lighting and stuff are just a problem. And makes me just feel like it could have been an entirely different director hired by the studio told them to like insert something. But generally speaking, it's visually fine. It's visually appealing in the fact that it does nothing offensive, and is very legible. It is very readable. So I don't have a lot to say there other than I think it works. The costuming is interesting because this is a movie ostensibly about the fashion industry. Sort of. No, I mean, it is. They say it is, but it's not. Like, when we were watching this, we were talking about how, like, comparing it to The Devil Wears Prada, which is an impossible connection not to make because it's Anne Hathaway in a movie about fashion, right? And that did like set up some, I have to admit, some certain expectations or thoughts we might not have had if we had not all seen that movie before, because we're like, oh, are they gonna do like a flip on The Devil Wears Prada, where this time it's Anne Hathaway who's like completely awful to people, but it doesn't go that way. Anyway, so the comparisons were obviously there, and we were trying to make them, but they fall apart, or they don't fall apart. They just are proven not to be true very quickly. And I think that's a positive thing as well. It makes the character... Well, no. I was going to say it makes the character a little shallower. It makes Hathaway's character a little shallower. But no, actually, Hathaway's character is painted in the film as being kind of unapproachable and not easy to work with. And it could have very quickly gone to a place of something like Devil Wears Prada, or something a lot worse, where a female character is presented as like bitchy and demeaning, and like it's just a bad representation of women in film. Devil Wears Prada is not so bad, but like I'm sure you can think of a number of other characters in things where it's just like, oh, strong woman must be bitchy, and they really managed to avoid that. And I would have liked to see her struggles be emphasized a little bit more, but at least it doesn't go to the place of, painting her with really broad and kind of gross strokes. Overall, tonally, I have to say it's a relatively like positive. I hesitate to say feminist, but like it's a positive modern representation of like gender dynamics in business in a modern era without feeling like it's lectury at any point. Acknowledging the struggles while also not like playing them for bad narrative purposes. Anyway, I'm getting derailed. What was I saying? The characters are pretty good. I really like De Niro's character. I think he puts on an excellent performance. I have some narrative problems with where he lands because he sort of at some point stops being a character of his own and is mostly there to facilitate the rest of the story happening. That doesn't make him like a foil or a sidekick or a more minor character to Hathaway's, but he sort of stops having clear definition of his own, and the story really focuses on her more than him, in a way that I think is a little bit of a shame to have lost it. All the other his performance is really excellent and very subtle, and I don't think I've seen De Niro play a character quite like this before, and props to him for putting on that performance. I think it's actually really good and kind of quiet and subtle, and the character that he plays is not who you expect out of De Niro. I'm actually going to get back to the casting in a minute, but the rest of the performances in the movie are okay. I think everybody's casting is kind of fine, but none of the performances are particularly good. There's a bunch of actors there who I have seen in other things before, and I know are capable of much better performances. We talked about Renee Russo. She's in this film as a not insubstantial character, but kind of has not a lot to do, even though she's present for a lot of it. We've talked about her in a couple of other films that I've watched. Tom's Crown and Velvet Buzzsaw, and I think something else too. She's kind of a minor character here and is fine. There's also a couple of castings that I know these people are capable of better performances. Anders Holm, Adam Devine, and Andrew Rannells are all in here, and they're not great. But that has more to do with just, I think the writing is a little bit of a problem. The direction may not be that strong in terms of like making them give the performances they need, but the three of them are also people who I think are just sort of fine as actors as well. So I don't have a really strong feeling that I like demand more out of them. They're fine. But weirdly, after watching this, I was looking over the Wikipedia article and I found just the most bizarre thing. Allegedly, this was the original casting for this was supposed to be Tina Fey and Michael Caine, which is insane to me. Not because it couldn't work, but because it would be an entirely different film, I believe. Tina Fey is like 15 years older than Anne Hathaway, and Anne Hathaway also already has a very young looking face. Like her facial structure looks younger than she is. And let me be very clear, this is not like me digging at women of a certain age in Hollywood, not at all. But because the setup for the film is about a young person doing an internet startup with like limited business experience and who's in over her head, casting somebody older I think would have been a mistake if they didn't also change a whole bunch of other things about the narrative. Meanwhile, Michael Caine I'm sure he can put on the grandfatherly performance, but it seems like he's very grandfatherly in most things these days. And I question whether he could have put on the same kind of like subtlety and the same kind of like supportive without being intrusive performance that De Niro put on here. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'd be interested to be to I would love to see the version of the film that has Faye and Kane instead, but I think it would be completely different. So like this it's an interesting film overall. The problem is, now I'm going to talk about the final issue with it, and it's about the actual structural arc in the background, which is not really the focus of the film in the first place, but it has to, like, there has to be a conflict, right? So I'm going to talk about the main arc that really only exists in the second half of the film, and then the way that it ends, because it's bizarre. So I mostly like this film. I think it could do a lot more, but like, as far as just sort of a feel good performance, it's pretty decent. And you can sign off now if you want to go watch it. The problem is that they made the main conflict in the film about Anne Hathaway's failing marriage with her husband, who has no character whatsoever and is just generically cheating on her. And because of the way everybody else is painted in the film, and that Anne Hathaway is not even, like, she's painted as a pretty good mother to her child. It's not like a cliche setup of, oh, one parent is completely absent from the household and is a shitty parent, and you are kind of upset with them as a character and you think they have problems. No, Anne Hathaway's really painted as like very overwhelmed by her work, but still very present in her family life. And so the arc of, oh, she's absent and therefore he cheats, is 100% just feels like him being shitty. And so this gets back to what I was saying before about the agency of the issue being so weird. You can't even really validate, at least not by the text of the film, him cheating on her, because usually when you have a conflict like that in a narrative, it's because, hey, Anne Hathaway is completely absent and therefore he's still a piece of shit, but he's slightly valid in wanting emotional support or whatever shitty reason he has for cheating, that he's got a little bit of a point. But he doesn't in this film at all. Like, he's just a piece of shit. And then they get back together at the end, and he like comes around, and it feels very unsatisfying. Well, I don't know. Some people may not be as passionate about like fuck people who cheat, but I still think that even for somebody less passionate about that, I still think there is very little reason or very little emotional investment in that relationship that should make anyone like believe or feel positive about them, reconciling at the end. That also gets to the point about De Niro's character sort of being turning into a bit of a side character and just being supportive rather than actually being involved. Rather than having a narrative about him giving her them having a back and forth between in their insights and the things that they have and don't have, and the experiences that they can share and learn from each other. He instead just sort of becomes a supporting character for this conflict about like her being a little bit overly obsessed with her job and there being this relationship issue as a result. It's the wrong arc to take in the narrative, I think. I think it's just a mistake. I don't even think she should be married and have a kid. I mean, not that it's necessarily a problem. It's just there's no reason for that to be an aspect of the narrative at all. It adds nothing, really. And I think it takes away from the possibility of the buddy comedy thing being stronger. Even worse is the very end of the film, where I actually made a joke and then it came true. We were watching the end of the film. The film opens with De Niro doing Tai Chi in the park, and he's narrating over it and saying how, like, oh, he tries to find things to fill his time and have new experiences and all these other kinds of things because he's widowed and retired. And that's the very beginning of the film, and then the very end of the film, he's out for some reason that's not particularly well explained in the middle of a workday where he's normally present. He's out doing Tai Chi in the park, and then Hathaway's character goes to the park and sees him, and she sees him over a hill, and I made a quip about, like, oh, and now she goes and does Tai Chi in the park, and then we fade to black, and that's the end of the film. And then that happened. That's it. Like, they don't even really have an exchange. She walks up to him, tries to talk to him. He's like, no, we're doing Tai Chi. Then he gives her like 3 very brief instructions on like how to do Tai Chi, and then it fades to black. And I understand that narratively what they're trying to say there is like, oh, it's an indicator that she's gotten more balance in her life. You know, Tai Chi is supposed to be about calm and balance and having like control, and obviously that's what they're saying, but it's just bizarre because they just fade to black and like a bunch of things are not really talked about or concluded, not in a way that's necessarily unsatisfying. It's just kind of silly, especially when the film up to that point, like the last 15 minutes prior to that, had been really having a lot of like the most of the climactic conflicts and this escalating emotional states for a bunch of different characters. To have it just suddenly be like, and everybody lived happily ever after doing Tai Chi in the park, is very silly. I don't know why they did that. It doesn't ruin the movie, but it's just bizarre. So anyway, if you happen to have seen this film, or if you go and watch it after watching this video, please let me know, as always, in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. This one's interesting, and, you know, as far as, like, comedies from the mid-2000s, it's pretty good. I actually hadn't even thought to compare one-to-one to Game Night or Gringo, but, like, in a snap judgment right now, I think this might be the best balanced of the 3. It has the least overt complaints for me, and is just kind of pleasant. It's a pleasant watch, and it is 2 hours, but it actually doesn't feel insanely long either. It works out all right. I think it's a little bit of an undersung joke. Oh, one other thing. Apparently Quentin Tarantino loves this film and thinks that it's an excellent performance from Robert De Niro, which I agree with. But like, it's just it's bizarre that like on the Wikipedia page for this, there's a particular quote from Tarantino about how much he likes this film and thinks it's really excellent. But that amuses me to no end. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.